Hey guys, we'll see how this goes. Um, so, for the introduction, this chapter is about criminal law. And for criminal law, the main thing for you to know is that there's a big difference between crimes and civil procedures. So, crimes, as this slide says, is they are a wrong against society, and they have a different type of a fine or a punishment that's associated with that, including and up to the death penalty. And typically, crimes are prosecuted. They are charged by the public because they are considered crimes against society. So, when you look up a case, if you are board and look up a case, you will find, if it's a criminal procedure, a criminal charge, you will find that it is the state versus so and so, or the federal government versus so and so. There are two big differences in civil and criminal law. The burden of proof is one, and criminal sanctions is the other. The burden of proof in a civil case, you have to prove your case by what's called the preponderance of the evidence. So, in that case, if there's a jury, 3/4 of the jurors have to be in agreement with the charges that are being levied in order for you to be charged and for that to hold up. In a criminal case, you guys are familiar with this, must be beyond a reasonable doubt. And in those situations, it must be a unanimous opinion. So everyone has to agree with the outcome. So the punishments for criminal cases are much more severe, obviously, than those that result from civil cases. Civil cases, anytime you want to think about the difference between the two, civil cases are things that you would see on Judge Judy. So my neighbor trimmed my trees and I'm not happy with that. I contracted with someone to build me a deck and they never showed up. Those types of things are civil crimes or civil cases. So the punishment for a crime can include fines as well as loss of liberty, which would be imprisonment. Typically, and this is listed on this slide, they most often include probation, and sometimes they include community service, completion of some kind of a program. So if you are a person who has drug problems or whatever, you might have to go into drug rehab, or if you have anger issues, you might have to go into anger management, and then a payment of a fine. And like I said earlier, they can result in the death penalty. So civil liability for criminal acts. So sometimes there's a civil aspect to criminal cases. So assault and battery can have both criminal and civil action associated with that, and your book has an example of that. I won't go through that. But if you injure someone in a car accident, for example, and you were drunk at the time, there may be a civil piece where you have to pay restitution for the aspect of that beyond just the crime itself. Your book has also a chart that includes the difference between civil law and criminal law on page 142. That might be helpful as well. If you would like a picture of that, I can also upload that. So the classification of crimes, I find this chapter really interesting. Part of the thing that I think is kind of interesting is just because it's really applicable and we can all say, hey, we've seen examples of this. Felonies obviously are serious crimes, the most serious of crimes, and they are punishable by death or imprisonment for more than a year. And obviously there's varying degrees of felonies. You're welcome to read about those as well. But first-degree felonies, those types of things. First-degree murder, think about those types of things. Second-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, you hear those, and that's kind of what that means. Misdemeanors are the less serious crimes. They're the things that you would be charged with for speeding, for example, or parking violations or things like that. So those are punishable typically by a fine or confinement up to a year. The lesser of those misdemeanors are called petty offenses. No connection to me. They are minor violations. So you are a landlord and you didn't update the wiring in a specific building or a room to a certain code, a building code. Now, if it could cause someone to die and you knew that, that could elevate the level of crime. But once it's determined which type of crime it is, that also helps dictate which type of court is going to hear it and whether or not there will be a jury involved with it. So criminal liability, if you are going to be convicted of a crime, I don't know about you guys, but when I was little, I used to be so worried, and this is so stupid, but so worried that I would accidentally commit a crime. There's no chance of that, actually. To be convicted of a crime, you have to do these two things together. And if you've seen Legally Blonde, you should be familiar with these terms. Number one is the performance of a prohibited act, so something bad. Actus rei is what that says, and that's also called a guilty act. Is another way to say that. And the second is a specified state of mind or intent. So a mens rea, which has to do with, you could also call that a guilty mind. So guilty act and guilty mind. So you can't accidentally commit a crime because you couldn't have, without the mindset of committing a crime, there can be no crime. Which has to do with a lot of different, if you think about, people pleading insanity and things like that, that kind of goes back to that. So most crimes require an act of commission. So the difference in commission and omission: commission is you doing something, omission is obviously leaving something out. So your mom asks you if you got your studying done last night, and you say, yes, I did. You omitted the fact that the studying didn't happen until you got home from the bar and you were drunk. So it wasn't great studying, but that would be an act of omission, not an act of commission. So a prohibited act, obviously we talked about earlier, a guilty act, actus reus. Sometimes you can have, so an example of a crime that would be an act of omission, as shown on this example, is tax return filing. So I just didn't file my taxes. Now I've committed an act of omission crime. You can be punished for attempting to commit a crime, but typically you have to have taken some steps in that direction before that's possible. For example, go back to Brad Pistotnik. You can be punished for, you remember how we've talked about how he hired the hacker so brilliantly. He hired his hacker. Say the hacker never did anything. The fact that he hired the hacker would be enough to charge him of a crime of some degree. The state of mind, I liked this quote from this Michigan state representative. We're just saying that unless otherwise stipulated, you can't accidentally be a criminal. So the wrongful mental state, so it's required to establish a criminal liability, so a responsibility for a crime, you have to have intent. So that's why all the crime shows you've ever seen talk about establishing intent. There has to be a motive, kind of. One thing that can be recklessness can be one when an act is reckless or criminally negligent. So, for example, I own an amusement park. And my amusement park has faulty seatbelts on a roller coaster. That is criminally negligent or criminally reckless. So I consciously disregarded a substantial and justifiable risk. I had an idea that someone would be harmed, and I chose to do nothing about it. Another example of criminal negligence happened in the case of Michael Jackson's death. So mental state where the defendant takes that unjustified, substantial, and foreseeable risk that results in harm. You can also be held as negligent even if you weren't actually aware of the risk, but you should have known about the risk. So if you should have, if a normal person would have recognized that as a hazard. One example, as we talked about with the case of Thank you. One example, as we talked about with the case of Michael Jackson, homicide, it's typically called involuntary manslaughter if it results from an act of criminal negligence and there's no intent to kill. So if you recall in the case of Michael Jackson, which there's some more about this on page 143 in your book, but if you recall in the case of Michael Jackson, his doctor did not intend to kill him. They were not able to prove that he intended to kill him. He did commit an act of criminal negligence by giving him the drugs that he gave him, and he didn't understand or fully appreciate the risks that he was putting him in, and he accidentally, apparently, killed him. Strict liability. We've talked about strict liability a little bit. We talked about this. I think I mentioned it in terms of lawn darts. If you remember it's hard to talk to you guys when there's no one looking at me. The example of the lawn darts, if you guys remember that lawn darts used to be sold in stores in like the backyard fun, like with the badminton sets and things like that. They are no longer allowed to be sold because they have what's called strict liability attached to them, because use of these devices, those toys, carries a risk that no amount of protection, no amount of awareness can protect you against. Three-wheelers, you guys probably don't even remember that there used to be a thing called three-wheelers. They were outlawed because of the inherent risk that's associated with them tipping over and things like that. We're talking like the modern day four-wheeler used to only have three sometimes, and they were a lot cheaper and they were a lot of fun, but people were dying on them. Another example of strict liability is if I sell alcohol to a minor, even if I didn't intend to hurt that minor or cause them a problem or create an issue where they drove drunk and killed someone. Okay, let me get back to that. So even if you didn't intend to sell, you didn't maliciously sell alcohol to a minor with the intent to cause them to have a car accident that would kill someone, you still have strict liability. So you will still be held responsible and liable for that action, even if you didn't have the guilty mind that goes with normal commission of a crime. A lot of federal crimes don't require a specific mental state or intent, and you can read about those in your book as well. Or if you need pictures of that, just shoot me an email. So strict liability is typically pretty common in environmental law, drug laws, and public health and safety. So if you think about the example of selling alcohol to a minor, public health and safety goes into that. Or if you got on an airplane with something that was prohibited, that you could have some strict liability there as well. States also have a lot of laws that punish behavior as criminal without intent. There's a group of people, or a kind of a movement of people trying to fight what they call overcriminalization. So they believe that strict liability shouldn't be a thing. And you can have your own opinion about that. I don't know that I necessarily have an opinion as it goes with that. Corporate criminal liability. It used to be that courts didn't view corporations as appropriate for a criminal punishment, because corporations are not people and they can't act on their own. They act through agents. So that would mean that there was no way for them to have an intent. They would just have acts, not intent. So there wouldn't be a crime associated with that. Now that's changed. And so there is intent. There's implied intent. So they can be fined or have legal privileges denied. Last thing on this video, the liability of the corporate entity. So corporations, we've talked about this in lots of ways, but I won't go through this example on video because my son is sitting here and it's not exactly the nicest example. But on page 144, there's an example. But corporations are liable for whatever crimes their agents and their employees commit if the employees are at work at the time or working, doing something related to their work. More